The American Civil War, a conflict that shaped the United States, a war fought between brothers, neighbors, and ideologies. But despite its heavy subject, we're going to break it down in a way that's easy to understand and, dare I say, even a little fun. Our story begins in the early 1800s. The United States was expanding, stretching its borders further and further west. But as new states joined the Union, so did a growing divide. In the North, cities were booming with factories, industry, and waves of immigrants seeking work. It was a world of innovation, steam engines, and bustling trade. Meanwhile, the South had built its wealth on large plantations, where enslaved people worked the land, producing cotton that fueled the economy. These weren't just economic differences. They were cultural, political, and deeply personal. The North and South were growing apart, and many wondered if they could remain a single nation. As time passed, the tension only grew stronger. Debates over slavery dominated politics, and compromises barely held the Union together. Then came the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer from Illinois, won the presidency, and the South panicked. Lincoln wasn't an abolitionist, but he opposed the expansion of slavery. Southern leaders feared this was the beginning of the end for their way of life. One by one, Southern states announced their departure, seceding from the Union and forming their own country, the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. Then came April 12, 1861. The morning was quiet in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, as Union soldiers held Fort Sumter. Suddenly, Confederate cannons erupted, shaking the ground and sending smoke into the sky. The war had begun. For 34 hours, shells rained down on the fort until the Union soldiers surrendered. News spread like wildfire. America was officially at war with itself. At first, many believed this war would be over in months. Young men eagerly signed up, expecting a quick and glorious victory. The first major battle, Bull Run, shattered those illusions. As Union and Confederate soldiers clashed, civilians from Washington, D.C. arrived with picnic baskets, treating it like a show. But soon, the battlefield turned into chaos. Smoke, screaming horses, and terrified soldiers filled the air. The Confederacy won the day, and it became clear this war would be long and brutal. The following years saw even more devastation. At Shiloh, men fought through thick woods, the sounds of gunfire echoing for miles. Bodies littered the ground as generals realized this war would be fought to the last man standing. Meanwhile, the Union hatched a plan, a way to suffocate the South. They called it the Anaconda Plan, a massive naval blockade, cutting off supplies and trade, slowly strangling the Confederacy's economy. By 1863, the war had reached its turning point. In July, Confederate General Robert E. Lee led his troops north, hoping for a decisive victory. But at a small town in Pennsylvania, they were met by Union forces in what would become the bloodiest battle of the war, Gettysburg. For 3 days, cannon fire and rifle shots filled the air. Thousands fell, and on the third day, Confederate forces made a desperate charge, running straight into Union gunfire. It was a disaster for the South. Lee's army retreated, and the Confederacy never truly recovered. Shortly after, Lincoln stood on the battlefield, surrounded by the graves of fallen soldiers. In just 272 words, he delivered the Gettysburg Address, a speech that redefined the war, not just a fight for unity, but for freedom and equality. Meanwhile, another Union general was making history, Ulysses S. Grant. While Gettysburg raged, he was laying siege to Vicksburg, a Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. When it fell, the South was split in two. Then came Sherman's march to the sea. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman led his men on a brutal campaign, burning farms, tearing up railroads, and destroying everything in their path. His goal was simple: break the South's will to fight. By the time he reached the coast, Georgia was left in ruins. The war was nearing its end. In April 1865, surrounded and outnumbered, General Lee met Grant at a small courthouse in Virginia. In a quiet room, Lee removed his sword, and Grant, refusing to gloat, simply nodded. The war was over. The Confederacy had surrendered. The Civil War left over 600,000 dead, entire cities in ruins, and a nation scarred. Slavery was abolished, but the fight for true equality had just begun. Reconstruction followed, a time of rebuilding, new laws, and new struggles. Formerly enslaved people gained rights, but the South resisted change. The wounds of the war would take generations to heal. Even today, the Civil War's impact is everywhere, in politics and culture, in the way we remember history. It was a war that defined America. And now, you know the story, simplified and hopefully a little more engaging.